Christy Beal from the UCFRB Advisory Council from Missoula.
Elizabeth Erickson from the Butte Natural Resource Damage Council in Butte.
Valerie Kurth from the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation.
Michael Harris, Attorney General's Office.
Hi, I'm Bill Shank with the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks.
Chris Dorrington, Director at Montana DEQ.
And I'm Doug Martin with the Natural Resource Damage Program. Would also like to recognize the staff that we have in the audience and also online. We have Brian Barkowiak, who will be talking. Nathan Cook and Ray Vinke are here, as well as Miranda and Jody have been very helpful in our administrative duties throughout this process this year. Online, we do have Aspen Ward, who we had hoped that could be here, but she couldn't be here today. But she is one of the new staff attorneys that we have at the Natural Resource Damage Program.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you for the team for putting all this together. And thank you to Christy and the Advisory Council for a lot of work that went in before today. We have a lot to try to get through. We have a lot of material for awareness, and we have action items to take, and we will have time for public comment as well. And so we better go ahead and get started. Doug, will have you get going.
Thank you, Chris. So just to let everybody know, this meeting is recorded, recording this as the minutes. And so if you do have comments, the council would ask you to turn on your mic and state your name. And if you're from the audience and you have a public comment, we are going to ask you to come up front to give your presentation so that there is a mic, so it's easier for the mic. Or I guess you could grab the mic back there and talk as well, but we would like you to talk into the mic so that it makes the recording. So the agenda for today, Brian Barkowiak will give the Broken Circle split season lease discussion. That is an action item that we're asking the council to make a recommendation on. I will then go through the 2023 draft revisions to the Upper Clark Fork River Aquatic and Terrestrial Resources Restoration Plan with the help of Christy Beal, the chairperson of the Advisory Council, and her input and the input that the council had during the process. We will close with the, we're going to give you a brief, only a brief summary of the financial and project updates this year because of the full schedule of the revision and the action items prior to that. But we will be available for any questions on either of those documents that you may have at the end. So one of the things that is actually good to go through, since we do have action items, the action items will be presented to you. The Advisory Council, Christy will give the Advisory Council's input and discussions that they had on those items. The trustees or the council will have time for questions, as will the public. Then we'll move to the motion process where there will be a motion made, a discussion of that, and public comment on that, and then finally the vote. So we will step through this process as quickly as we can. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian to start on the funding recommendation for the Broken Circle.
Thank you, Doug. I'm Brian Barkowiak with the Natural Resource Damage Program. I'm going to be presenting on the Broken Circle split season lease funding recommendation today. I'll start with a brief, some project background and overview of our funding request. Turn it over to Christy to provide the AC input into their AC's recommendation, and then questions and TRC motion. So just to orient you, the project is located just south of Deer Lodge and involves water rights held by the state of Montana Natural Resource Damage Program that were part of the Clark Fork River Ranch purchase. Water rights held by the Greco family, and specific to this project, water rights held by the Broken Circle Ranch Company. The Clark Fork River Ranch was purchased in 2019. That purchase included a combination of funds from the Clark Fork River restoration account. It does include 5 miles of the Clark Fork River. It aids in access for that cleanup, helps DEQ and NRD with available borrow materials, willows, and things like that. Another source of funding was the terrestrial funds. This isn't a priority 1 area and does have a very diverse wildlife habitats. And then most specifically to this funding request, aquatic flow funds. The property came with significant water rights on Valentin Ditch. And this is also in one of the most dewatered sections of the Clark Fork River. And one of the resource benefits identified was to use water from Valentin Ditch more efficiently to benefit aquatic life in this critically dewatered section of the Clark Fork River. So what is a split season lease? A split season lease just allows a water right holder to use water during part of the season and then lease that water to in-stream flow for the other part of the season. It balances the need of agricultural and resources. And then the terms of this lease and our agreement with the Greco family is they are allowed to irrigate until July 15th, regardless of Clark Fork River flows. After July 15th, they can continue irrigating as long as the Clark Fork stays above optimal levels, which is 180 CFS in Deer Lodge. Once it drops below those levels after July 15th, we are asking them to discontinue irrigation and put that in in stream. On average, the Clark Fork doesn't drop below these levels 9 out of 10 years. And based on actual monitoring results of water going down Valentin Ditch, this is putting 13 CFS of real water into the Clark Fork River. So what does this project look like? If I can find the mouse. These are the pivots owned by the state of Montana or Clark Fork River Ranch. We have a agreement with the Grecos that they have use of our pivots and our water rights up until July 15th or when the flows stay above optimal levels. In exchange for when flows drop after July 15th, they discontinue not only using our water rights, but their water rights as well. We've worked for a number of years trying to get the last remaining irrigated acres owned by Broken Circle off the ditch to maximize the benefits. Finally, last year, Broken Circle came to us and said, hey, our kids are grown up, they're moving to college, we need to reduce our workload. Is there any way we could enter a similar lease agreement as you have with the Grecos? We said, yep, that's a fantastic idea. So we worked with them and we came up with a water valuation. This is based on their lost production from not using that late season water. We estimated that lost production to be about $20,200. Projecting that out for the 20 years of the anticipated lifespan of that irrigation infrastructure, we had a total project cost of $404,000. We just got word last week that the Clark Fork Coalition, our project partner, put in for a funding request from the Columbia Basin Water Transaction Program, and they were approved for $200,000 of cost share for this project. Going through our funding request, cost effectiveness, cost benefit. Split season leases are successful in-stream flow projects. They work well in other states. They allow, as I said before, agricultural production to continue while balancing late season irrigation withdrawals and resource benefits. Monitoring conducted by our project partners has shown that the Clark Fork River in this area has dropped below 20 CFS and stays above temperatures that are harmful to trout. So 13 CFS is a significant flow at those low water levels. Cost benefit at the total project cost of $404,000. We rank this as a high cost benefit with the cost share from the Clark Fork Coalition through the Columbia Basin Water Transaction Program. We would rank this as a very high cost benefit. In terms of technical feasibility, this project is feasible. The water is there. We've measured it already. Our restoration project agreement with Broken Circle is requiring them to go through a DNRC change application, both protecting their water rights and protecting the flows in stream. We have an established flow monitoring program that we monitor flows in above and below and down the ditch and temperatures, and we will continue that. And we have also been doing intensive monitoring of crop health as part of this split season lease as a example of what can be done on other potential leases. This project does provide a significant amount of public benefit. The increased flows will benefit fish populations on the main stem river, which will result in increased recreational opportunities in terms of angling and other types of recreation. These water rights are senior to the Milltown water right, which will contribute to mitigation efforts for the Milltown water right. And then this agreement helps support the continuation of agricultural open spaces, which provides natural resource benefits in the upper Clark Fork Basin. We did take this out for a 30+ day public comment period. We received 4 comments back, all very supportive of the project. Again, we will continue to monitor temperature flows and fishery benefits in conjunction with FWP. There may be additional monitoring required as part of the change application. The recommendation the NRD staff made to the advisory council was to recommend funding of this project up to $404,000 from the upper Clark Fork Aquatic flow allocation, with the contingency that if matching funds are obtained, the funding would be reduced by this amount. And with that, I'll turn it over to Christie to provide the AC's input and recommendation.
There was discussion by the advisory council, the AC, related to the impacts on crops in the split season lease properties and the fact that there's monitoring and research in coordination with the state universities, one of which I will mention has a little football game on Saturday. But the monitoring and research relative to the split season leasing that was occurring, and that the fact that that will result in better understanding of management that is consistent with these split season leases, such as potential reseeding, that would be a benefit to the landowners as well as to the natural resources, and may perhaps also, that research and that monitoring may perhaps also increase interest in these types of leases, interest and education in these types of leases for future. And the advisory council made the motion to approve the Broken Circle split season lease funding, as is on the screen here. And that motion passed with no objection.
And with that, I think we turn over for Chris for questions.
Does anybody at the table have questions about this project for either Brian or Christie?
Add 2, Chris, if you don't mind. The first is, you said 9 out of 10 years you're above that flow. Is that just a rolling 9 out of 10? Or is it in the last 10, 9 of those years have been that above that flow?
Thank you, Director Dorrington. It's looking at long-term averages. So on average, 9 out of 10 years flows, and I might have said it backwards, 9 out of 10 years flows drop below optimal.
Dropped below.
Yes, by
Okay.
optimal levels.
Yeah.
So in effect,
Which emphasizes the need for the split season. Yeah, I got you.
correct.
So how long was the data set? I mean, are you going back like 25 years or just?
I'm sorry, I don't remember
That's all right.
it's the
Ish
historic,
is fine.
it's a historic period of record at the Deer Lodge Gauge.
Okay. And then my second question on the cost benefit, are you not able to get a numeric cost benefit? You just had a qualitative, very high CB?
Yeah, all of our funding recommendations have been that qualitative cost benefit. We did look at the per acre foot compared to similar projects. Our program did a water lease with Butte Silverbow from Silver Lake a few years ago.
Yep.
This is slightly less than that.
Okay.
Looking at FWP's water lease with Rock Creek, it is more than that, but it's within the range on a per acre foot basis of what people are paying.
Great. Thank you.
Any additional questions? Mike?
The question I would have is I understood the valuation methodology used, but is there a consistent valuation methodology that we follow, like USPAP for appraisal purposes you would on land? Because if we're establishing a valuation methodology that's being used across the state for determining, these water rights, we want to ensure that we're not giving one ratio for one landowner that looks like we're doing a favor. There should be something that consistently across the board, we can protect the analysis. So I wasn't sure if there's a specific methodology we follow.
This methodology was based on the water evaluation report conducted for the Upper Clark Fork Basin. There is no quote unquote standard. It's honestly, it's kind of a fuzzy science. The range of water, there's a huge range in water values, and we just try to make sure we are within that range.
I appreciate that question, Mike. When we talked about the Silver Lake project last year, 2 years ago, when it was, whenever it was really dry, I remember asking that same thing, is this within the standard? And the description to me at the time was that it very much depends on the time of year. What else is happening? What problem are you trying to solve? And so there's not necessarily the same type of standard. And that's why it's kind of up to us to ask these questions here and make sure that it's dollars are spent appropriately. Any other questions?
This is Christy Beal. I would just add a comment that I think that land valuations are a bit of a fuzzy science too, that have a lot of factors that affect it.
I think that looks like it does it here at the table. Do we have any questions or comments from the public in the room? Do we have any online? I don't know who's monitoring online. Okay. Great. With that, might I ask for a motion? Valerie, are you?
Thank you. I move that the UCFRB TRC recommends accepting the NRDP and UCFRB Advisory Council's recommendation to fund the Broken Circle split season lease in the amount of $404,000 from the UCFRB Restoration Fund Aquatic Flow Allocation following the execution of the restoration project agreement, with the contingency that if matching funds are obtained, the funding amount would be reduced by the amount of those funds.
Second.
Second, this is Chris Dorrington.
I don't need to. Okay. Sorry, I was just getting our order down. Is there any discussion on the motion? Any public comment on the motion? With that, we'll proceed. I seeing none, we'll proceed to a vote. All in favor of the Broken Circle split lease motion as stated by Valerie, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, please say no. Motion carries. Thank you. Appreciate it, Brian. Way ahead of schedule. Love it. I'll probably curse myself by measuring in such a way, but I think we're having good questions, good conversation. Next we have our friend Doug up. This might be a little more in depth.
This will be a little longer. So, but I'm going to go over the 2023 revisions to the Upper Clark Fork River Aquatic and Terrestrial restoration plans. The one thing to start out, I want to start out with what the goals of these plans are. On the aquatic side, the main goal is to restore the main stem trout fishery by improving the recruitment to the main stem from the tributaries. So a lot of our focus is on the tributaries. Most of the main stem work is being done by DEQ and the Natural Resource Damage Program with other restoration funds. We're also looking at replacing the lost fishing opportunities or the angling opportunities by improving these tributary fisheries. And the third goal is to maintain or improve the native trout fishery within the Upper Clark Fork River Basin. On the aquatic side, we're looking at restoring the injured terrestrial resources associated with the ecological and recreational services that these resources provided that were also covered by the Montana VARCO lawsuit. We're also looking at replacing those resources by protecting and enhancing grasslands and other habitats within the Upper Clark Fork, similar to those that were injured. And the third is to replace lost hunting, wildlife viewing, bird watching, and other wildlife related outdoor recreational opportunities. So these are the goals that when we're implementing and what we're looking at for revising and improving the restoration plan that we go back to make sure that we're making sure that we're meeting these goals. So getting into the process that we started this year, I am going to go over the process. I'm going to give a summary of the projects that we received, the summary of the public comment. I will provide the Natural Resource Damage Program's recommendation, and Trustee will provide the Advisory Council's recommendations and discussion topics that they had. Then we'll have some questions, and then we'll get to the motion and public comment. So this process for the revision was scheduled 4 years ago. So it was supposed to occur 4 years after approval of the last plan. So in early 2023, we started the process, and a lot of this process is laid out in the Upper Clark Fork River Basin interim final plan, and that basically lays out the structure in which we should follow. So in the early part of 23, we actually solicited the public for projects and also revisions to the restoration plan and their ideas for those revisions. At the end of the day, we got 23 project ideas that were submitted to us. I would note that, I'll talk about the funding that we have available to allocate in a couple slides here, but the projects that were submitted were about twice the amount of money that we had to allocate. So if we're saying we're going to allocate approximately $6 million, we got over $12 million of requests. So there was more requests than we had dollars for. We did present these projects to the Advisory Council in May, and we also asked the participants, the project sponsors, to come, and they also gave presentations and summaries of their projects to the Advisory Council. We took those projects as well as the revision ideas that we got from the public, as well as our own ideas that we thought we needed to update in the plan. And we put those in a draft plan that went out for public comment starting on June 16th through July 19th. So we had a little over a 30-day public comment period. And in that same period, we did present these revisions to the Advisory Council meeting, or to the Advisory Council at a public meeting in Deer Lodge. Following the public comment period, we got a little over 100 comments in, and we had a public meeting in October where we presented those public comments and our revision to the plans based on those public comments to the advisory council. I would note that the advisory council put in a long day that day, as did project sponsors and others. I think we got done at 7 o'clock. We started at 1 and got done at 7. It was a very long day, and the council members hung in very well throughout that. So that's where we are today. So we're going to present the revisions that we proposed, the public comment that we received, and the advisory council's recommendations, as well as the staff's recommendations. As far as the funding goes, I do want to make it clear that when we're talking about the numbers as I go through the presentation, everything balances out. We have not over allocated the funding. We're not taking from projects that have already been allocated that don't need the money. So the funding does balance out. So from the last revision until the day we picked in March, at the end of the third quarter, the state's third quarter, there was about $4 million in interest that had accrued in the aquatic pot. Our restoration fund is divided into separate pots. And so the aquatic pot had about $4 million that could be allocated. The terrestrial pot is low enough that it did not accrue enough interest to allocate this year. There's also about $1.4 million that we do believe that's been allocated that can be moved to other pots. The funding is not necessary at this point. I will go through that in a little more detail when I talk specifically about that. And then we also have the parrot tailings removal project. We have completed that project. There will be some funds left over, and those funds will be reallocated per the Butte Area 1 reimbursement agreement. So about 51% of the parrot tailings leftover funds would come back to the Upper Clark Fork River Restoration Plan, or actually the Upper Clark Fork River Restoration Fund. But there are some specific ties to that, and that's that last bullet there. Those funds have to follow the requirements that are in the plans for how those funds can be used. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So as I did note earlier, we did take the restoration plan out for public comment. We received 101 comments, and I will go through these comments briefly. They are all in your packet. And the aquatic section, that's section 3, we got about 12 letters or comments. Section 4, we had 1 from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Section 5 was where we received the most comments. There were 9 letters from the Middletown State Park, 26 for the Greenway Service District, and a whopping 61 for the Clark Fork River Education Program. And we had 1 comment on section 6, which was our implementation section. So when we presented this to the advisory council, our recommendation was to recommend the revisions that we proposed. And these have changed based on public comment. So now I'm actually going to go through the restoration plan and kind of outline the changes that we had per section. Some of the sections are easier, so I'm not going to go through it in chronological order, as you'll see as I walk through this. Yes?
This is Chris. Quick question. You said that your recommendation changed based on public comment, based on the 101 that you received?
That is
modified?
correct.
Okay, and just
Yes,
making
yes.
sure. Thanks.
I am going to go back to a slide here. The one thing I would like to reiterate is that, I guess I did talk about that. I'm sorry. We'll keep moving. Sorry about that. Sections 1, the introduction, and section 2 of the restoration plan is the background. These are administrative sections, and all we did is in this section was have administrative updates. For instance, we briefly talk about each public comment period that we have, when we had it, that type of thing. So that's just an update to these sections. There were no public comments on either of the revisions that we had in these sections. Section 4, this is the terrestrial section. We did not have any significant revisions to this section either. These were, again, just some administrative updates that we proposed and needed to make. We had one comment from Fish, Wildlife and Parks, basically supporting the restoration plan's efforts in the terrestrial side to restore and replace those lost services and habitats. Section 6, we did have some updates in this section. The most of the updates were associated with matching funds. So we did add because of the funds are, we are spending the funds on priority projects and they are becoming more limited. There was a recommendation that we seek matching funds or look at getting matching funds for all of our projects. So the first change was to require the Natural Resource Damage Program or our partners to seek additional matching funds for priority aquatic and terrestrial projects. The second requirement would be to require 25% match for recreational dominant projects. And this would have to be non-Natural Resource Damage Program restoration funds. The third recommendation is to require that project sponsors for recreational dominant projects commit to long-term O&M of these projects so that these projects are maintained and not just built and then let go away. And then the last recommendation was for to put in that we would revise this plan again in 4 years. I would note that 4 years seems to be a very good timing for us on the renewal process. So we would we're proposing 4 years again. As far as public input on these sections 1, 2, 4, and 6, we did receive one comment in support of the matching funds, with the recognition that funds are becoming scarce and we are there's more restoration than there are dollars out there in the basin. I would note that the Greenway Service District comments, they had numerous comments. They weren't specific to Section 6. They were more specific to matching funds associated with the Greenway Service District or the Silverbow Creek Greenway Trail. And there were numerous comments there that suggested or wanted that there be no match requirement on the Greenway Service District. And with this, I will turn it over to Christy to talk about and I will note that you all have, and we passed it out, the advisory council's recommendations are on the 11/17 sheet that we passed out. They are on the left side and they are numbered, and the numbers that you'll see on the screen correspond to the number on the paper. The advisory council. The next section so now I'm going to actually talk about sections 3 and section 5, where we did have more significant updates. The section, the revision to the flow development process that's in section 3, in 2011, when we'd actually developed these restoration plans, the only way we were looking at improving flow, or the only consideration, was the acquisition of water rights. So the plan focused on the acquisition of water rights. So if we were to purchase water rights, what was the process we were going to go through? As Brian just talked about, there are a lot of other options out there that we have investigated over the years, and working with other partners in the basin and landowners and water users in the basin, there's other options and types of projects that we do need to consider in order for us to meet the goals of the restoration plan. So the revisions to the flow projects are not going to change the priority the priority areas. The dewatered reach is the dewatered reach south of Deer Lodge, so we're not changing those. We're not proposing to change the acquisition process. So if we were to purchase a water right, it would follow the same process that is outlined in the restoration plan. What we are doing is proposing an update to the restoration plan. So for us to consider projects much like the one that Brian just brought before you, water leases, water storage, water management, irrigation, or a combination of these projects, and folding these into a project like Brian did, and then just implementing those similar to how we implement other aquatic restoration projects such as fish screens or habitat improvement projects on the terrestrial side. And those are per section 6. So those projects, we work with the landowners, we work with our project partners, we develop project plans, we implement those plans, and then we actually bring them to the advisory council and the trustee council at the end of the year in our annual update. So that's what this proposal is proposing, that we would develop site-specific plans for each of these water projects. We would work with DNRC on whether a change application is needed or not. We would still define the water right and the water rate, define the protectable reach, and consult with our stakeholders, DNRC and FWP, on each of these projects, and then bring it before the councils, not for approval or a recommendation, but for annual update. We would those other projects, we are given the process and the restoration plan to go ahead and implement those. So that's what we're proposing with this. So like, for instance, Brian's project, he would be presenting that to you as a project that he had implemented in the annual update instead of asking for your approval of all of these. One of the other big amendments to Section 3, as many of you know, the fishery of the Clark Fork River is at historic lows. We have been working with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for quite some time on the monitoring, and Nathan Cook with the program has presented our monitoring activities to you in the past. But Nathan has continued to work with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to try to figure out where are the fish and in the upper Clark Fork. And we're proposing to allocate $1 million to help investigate that. A portion of that money would go to the investigation, and also a portion would hopefully go to implementation of restoration actions to help remedy that issue. So the goal would be to assess that fishery so we can better meet the goals of the restoration plan. And in other terms of what we would like to do is we would really like to figure out what's going on. The goal of the restoration plan is to restore the main stem fishery. And right now, to do that, we have allocated most of that money to the tributaries and to flow projects. We would really like to know, is that really where we need to be allocating the money, or is there something else out there after 10 years of implementing this plan where we need to allocate the money to better address the process or what's going on with the fishery and better help us meet the goals of the restoration plan. We did receive comments on both of these sections. We had 2 comments on the flows that were in support of it. That, as it says here, we need some flexibility to meet the goals of the plan, and we also need multiple tools. That's something that has come up. As far as the monitoring, we did get 3 supporting comments supporting the investment of the evaluation of the fishery. And I will turn it over now to Christy to talk about motions 2 and 3 on the advisory council made.
Advisory council comments during this discussion focused on a request to focus on injured areas, continue focusing on injured areas, the importance of maintaining versus restoring fisheries, and the maintenance of fisheries versus restoring fisheries. One of those is more expensive than the other. And there was also, there's been discussion, I guess, over several meetings about the importance of coordinating the efforts of these monitoring efforts and evaluations, and making sure that there's some way that all of that data is being coordinated and isn't being analyzed in its own little vacuum. That's been a part of the discussion for several meetings. But with that, everybody agreed that figuring out what's going on with the fish and understanding what is impacting the fisheries is crucial, and the advisory council recommended that both motions 1 and 2 be passed, and was passed.
Yes, I'll correct you. It's motions 2 and 3, Chris.
I'm sorry. Yes, I apologize. I misspoke.
That's fine.
That, yeah, motions 2 and 3 were recommended to be passed and were indeed passed.
The next section of the restoration plan is, it's still in the aquatic section, but this is where we were actually allocating the dollars, the funds that are available to different projects or different watersheds. What you see on the screen are the names of the different watersheds or water bodies, and whether we were proposing to add funding to those or remove funding from those watersheds. Where you see a plus, those watersheds have, working with our partners at Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and with our partners, we looked at each of these watersheds to evaluate how much money was needed in each of those watersheds to implement the projects that are available in the next 4 years. So if you see a plus there, that indicates that we believe that additional funding is needed in that watershed to address projects that are potentially priority projects that are potentially implementable in the next 4 years. Where you see the minus, for instance, on Basin Creek and German Gulch, we have completed all of the available projects that are currently available in those watersheds. And I just know off the top of my head, there's $100,000 left in the German Gulch watershed that has been sitting there for several years. So those were dollars that we proposed that we move out of that watershed and move to another watershed so that they can be spent on priority projects. The Little Blackfoot River is a little different, and I will talk about that actually on this slide. So here is the actual allocations that we'd proposed on Silverbow Creek. We'd proposed increasing that funding to $500,000. The advisory council recommended the same thing. Same thing with Cottonwood Creek, Browns Gulch. The main stem diversions, that is a project. I'll come back to the highlighted ones. The main stem diversions is a project along the main stem Clark Fork, where we would work with partners on removing diversions and decreasing fish passage, or excuse me, decreasing fish entrainment along the main stem. This is something that was actually added to the restoration plan in 2008, in the 2018 revision, but we didn't add funding in 2018. We're proposing to add funding there this year. The Little Blackfoot River has approximately $1.7 million in its allocation. We know we are not going to spend $1.7 million on the Little Blackfoot in the next 4 years. So we proposed pulling some of that money out. The $1.2 million would be sufficient for any projects in the next 4 years. So our proposal was to move that to other watersheds or other priority projects. On Flint Creek and Rock Creek and Warm Springs Creek, the staff had proposed $200,000 to go to Warm Springs. The advisory council recommended an additional $225,000 go to Warm Springs. On Flint Creek and Rock Creek, the staff proposed funding. The advisory council did propose less funding in those watersheds. These are critical watersheds to the Clark Fork. Christy will talk some about the advisory council's thoughts on why moving that funding out of there. But the staff's recommendation was based on available projects that were available in these watersheds moving forward. So it's the public comment. We submitted all of this for public comment again, and we did receive one supporting public comment for the allocation to Silverbow Creek. The Silverbow Creek It doesn't get us quite as much publicity as the Clark Fork River fishery, but the Silverbow Creek fishery has not recovered initially, but then it has not continued to move up. It's actually depressed some. So Fish, Wildlife and Parks and Nathan with the NRD have suggested some allocation there to look at that fishery too. And what else can we do as far as restoration actions to try to improve that fishery? We did get a supporting comment for that. There are 3 other supporting comments on the allocation. 3 of them were specific to Flint and Rock Creek, supporting the funding there. One comment did recommend that we focus more on the injured area in the upper basin, i.e. Warren Springs Creek, Lost Creek, and Mill Creek. And I did highlight some of the differences here. For instance, the allocation to Mill Creek, we do think is sufficient at this time to address the priority projects that we know are available there. On Lost Creek is a flow inhibited stream. And when we developed the restoration plan, streams that have issues with flow, we did not propose doing aquatic restoration projects there because it's kind of hard to have fish without the water. So once we get the water there, then we could allocate some funding and work on those other projects. The one thing I would note on the monitoring for Flint Creek and Rock Creek, FWP has completed quite a bit of monitoring, and they do show that those watersheds do have an impact on the main stem. So they are helping us meet the goals of the restoration plan. And now I'll turn it over to Christy to talk about, she's got a whole bunch of motions here to talk about, but if you need help, let me know, Christy.
Okay. The first, so with these are grouped, like Doug said, out of order a little bit because of how we, as the advisory council decided to address them. The first one that we addressed was the original recommendation from the NRDP was for $225,000 to the Warm Springs Creek. And there was, excuse me, the original amount was 200,000, wasn't it? Yeah, it was 200,000 for Warm Springs. The advisory council had voted for, and I don't know if this is coming up, if I'm getting ahead of myself on the Milltown. But it affects the Warm Springs, yeah. So the Milltown structural issue had been allocated some money by the NRDP in the amount of $225,000. There's some structural problems with the lookout there, and the advisory council voted unanimously not to fund that repair work to that structural issue. The advisory council unanimously felt like Fish, Wildlife and Parks collects the fees for visitors and had a record year for visitation, and that Fish, Wildlife and Parks should be funding their own O&M and it should not be coming to this fund for those purposes. And so that $225,000, the advisory council felt was better spent on Warm Springs Creek, which is a priority 1 creek. And therefore, the advisory council voted unanimously to fund the Warm Springs Creek in the amount of the $425,000 instead of the $200,000 recommended by the advisory or by the NRDP. Warm Springs Creek, like I said, is a priority 1 stream. It's in need of rehabilitation to promote the sustainable trout population. And so the decision was made by the advisory council to focus the funding on that injured area. And the motion number 7 is stated. The advisory council recommended additional funding in the amount of $225,000 to Warm Springs, $225,000 to Warm Springs Creek from the Aquatic and Terrestrial Resources Restoration Fund, and that motion passed. And moving on then to your motion number, let's see. I have motion number 8 in mind. Okay. I'm going to address motion number 8 and motion number 13 together. 8 addresses Rock Creek and 13 addresses Flint Creek. There was a lesser amount allocated by the advisory council vote than the NRDP had recommended. Doug, do you mind popping back to that slide with the highlighted? There we go. Thank you. The advisory council reduced the Flint Creek funding and the Rock Creek funding by half. A number of advisory council members felt strongly that the 2 creeks, Flint and Rock, were not priority 1 creeks, and that more money should be focused on priority 1 restoration. And there was a lot of discussion in that regard, as well as a lot of discussion regarding the fact that the Rock Creek and Flint Creek projects bring matching funds to them. And that Rock Creek and Flint Creek are already very good fisheries. Again, the discussion about easier to maintain a fishery versus restoring it came up. But the advisory council did decide to focus, that they would like to focus the money on injured areas. I can tell you from discussions that I've had over the last few days, I know that there were several advisory council members, including me, that thought we had to save money somewhere in order to make all the allocations that were being recommended happen. And that we needed to cut back somewhere. There is funding though to, as I understand it, there is funding to handle all the allocations that that the advisory council has proposed. Trout Unlimited was not at the meeting, so we could not get the information that we needed about the funding and what amount would be lost in matching fund and matches. And I know that that information is available now, and I know that Casey is here to talk about that. Brian did mention though during the advisory council's meeting that there was significant matching funds that would be available, but we didn't know how much. The advisory council voted to reduce the funding to those 2 in comparison to what the NRDP recommended for those reasons. The discussion was to focus on the injured areas with the funds. So that addresses motions 8 and 13. Let's see, advisory council motion number 9 on Basin Creek and German Gulch. That motion was passed with no discussion, as well as motion number 12 on the mainstream diversion, Browns Gulch, Silverbow Creek, Cottonwood Creek, Little Blackfoot River. That motion was passed as well without discussion. Those are the easy ones, folks.
Thank you, Christy. Now we'll move on to section 5. This is the recreation. It was always the recreation section. This year is one of the projects, the Clark Fork River Education Program submitted a request, so we put it into the education, or into this section. So we did get 4 requests for additional funding for this section. The Milltown State Park did submit a request for $425,000 to relocate the bluff area, the overlook bluff. That is a cliff face that is that was above the former dam site, and there's some geotechnical issues with that. There's some cracks and it's sloughing in. They had requested funds for some capital costs to deal with that issue, as well as some O&M costs. The Natural Resource Damage Program recommended $225,000 for just the capital cost to move the bluff to a safe location. And as Christy noted just previously, the advisory council provided or offered or proposed not funding that. The multi-county recreational corridor, this was a grant that was submitted by Powell County for $210,000 or a little over that to do some planning and possibly some construction of multi-county trail from Warm Springs Ponds, basically Anaconda Deer Lodge County down to the Drummond area or Granite County. As I said, this was a planning grant, and they have agreed to the 25% matching funds that was proposed in section 6, as well as maintaining the trail moving forward. The Silverboat Greenway submitted a request. Their original request was for $9.2 million. We did have a good conversation with the service district, letting them know our funding limits, and asked them if they would propose a lesser amount. So they actually proposed $3.5 million for projects that could be submitted within the next not submitted, be completed within the next 4 years. The program proposed funding for up to $2.5 million for the design and construction of the 2 sections of trails. And we will both, and the advisory council did the same thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about the differences in those recommendations. The Clark Fork the Clark Fork Watershed Education Program submitted a request for $2.2 million for funding, or partial funding of their program for another 4-year period. We proposed a $1 million proposal, and the advisory council accepted this, and this would carry the Clark Fork Watershed Education Program for another 2 years of funding. The Clark Fork, so once again, these all received public comment. The Clark Fork Watershed Education Program received 60 supportive comments for their program. This program would be funded, we proposed the $1 million, and this would follow their current contract obligations, where they are required to provide a 50% match to this $1 million, as well as the program, the advisory council, and this council, the Trustee Restoration Council, would review their budgets on even number years and approve those budgets. With that, I'll let Christy talk about that proposal, that motion.
Okay. I'll start first with the motion number 4 regarding CFWEP, the Clark Fork Watershed Education Program. Throughout the process of discussing these funding allocations, there were multiple conversations with all of the requesting entities about the need this year, because there's less funds available to seek matching funds. And the advisory council really appreciated that the Clark Fork Watershed Education Program went out of its way. They did what we asked them to do, and that appreciation was expressed to them for their efforts in that regard, and that was acknowledged in the meeting by the advisory council, and in all of the meetings. The importance of this educational program and the long-term protection of our resources was acknowledged. Doug's not going to be here forever, though we wish he was, and all of you guys as well. But we've got that program is making sure we have people in the future who will protect these resources. And so the $1 million recommendation was passed unanimously by the advisory council. That was number 4. The Milltown State Park motion, that's number 5. As I said earlier, the advisory council rejected the NRDP's recommendations to fund that, and that was not funded at all. Felt like that was not a proper use of the fund. And let's see, the next, number 10 is the next one. The Multi-County Trail Coalition plan to develop the trail from Warm Springs Creek to Drummond. They committed to the match, and they committed to the O&M that we had asked, and that was passed as well by the advisory council.
Thank you, Christy.
And then the last, that was Milltown.
Yep, that's awesome. Yep.
Okay, that's that.
So a little more discussion on the Greenway Service District, because we did have some funding recommendations there. So the Greenway Service District submitted a grant for a request for $3.5 million for 2 sections of the trail. One is through what we call the Durant Canyon section, and the other one is down by Highway 1, which connects the rest area to Opportunity. They also requested funding for administrative and natural resource damage programs. Official or first proposal was to fund $2.5 million for the construction or design and construction of those two sections of trail. And we had proposed that this money would come from aquatic interest as well as reimbursement funds from the Parrot Tailings project. We would require the 25% match as well as a commitment to the long-term operation and maintenance. We did receive 25 comment letters for the Greenway Service District. And in 21 of those letters, they weren't all specific detailing certain bulleted items, but 21 of those letters specifically supported funding the Greenway Service District in full. And we took that as meaning in full as being the $3.5 million without match. There were several comments, as I pointed out earlier, that whether the match was a requirement or not, we took that as several comments would ask us to remove the matching requirement for the Greenway Service District. So listening to those comments, we did revise our recommendation to the Advisory Council based on public comment for a couple reasons. One, the reimbursement from the Parrot Tailings is not a given. We don't know exactly how much is coming out of that fund or coming back from that fund. And with the public comment asking for funding the Greenway Service District in full, we revised our allocation or our recommendation is that we would propose $2.5 million, and that $2.5 million would be insured. We would take it mostly from the Parrot if it was available, but if it wasn't, there are other funds available within the Upper Clark Fork River Restoration Fund that we can lean on. We do have funding in a contingency fund for aquatic projects and that type of thing. There is also interest that accrues over the years that could go to the Greenway Service District. So there are funds that we can pull on that we're not going to defund anything else to support the funding. And that's what we proposed here is that we would provide $2.5 million of funding regardless of what was available from the Parrot in that reimbursement. We did still require the 25% match in funds as well as the commitment to long-term O&M. And with that, I will turn it over to Trustee for the discussion on the Greenway Service District funding.
Okay, the discussion on the Greenway Service District was extensive. There was discussion about the land transaction delays that have contributed to the complexity of finishing this project. There was discussion about the usage numbers on the trails. But I will say by far, the amount of discussion that was had was related to matching funds. And there were two main issues that were addressed in the Advisory Council's discussions and with the public's input as well at those meetings. The matching funds, one, the advisability of using more money on a project that is primarily recreational where there isn't matching funds versus a projects where there are matching funds. Projects with, priority one stream issues. And then significant discussion related to whether there should be a requirement that they seek funding versus a requirement that they obtain matching funding. That was an extremely long discussion. I will note that there was comments by the Advisory Council. One of the Advisory Council members asked that since we had freed up funding from Creek and Flint Creek, could we use that to reduce the match requirement for the Greenway Service District? I will tell you, the advisory council struggled to get a motion that could be seconded on this because of the diverse opinions in relation to this project. Struggled mightily for hours and hours. And in the end, what we worked out was a compromise to the motions that were there. One, as Doug said, the NRDP had already recommended making sure the 2.5 was going to be there for them. And as you have there in motions 11 and 11A, particularly 11A, the advisory council ended up voting on a motion that if the funds were not available from the Parrot Tailings Project, the state's revised proposal was to use the funds allocated to ensure that the Greenway Services District received up to 2.5 million for the design and construction. Let me back up a second. There was discussion about whether design and construction includes attorney's fees. And there were recommendations, not recommendations, but there were suggestions that they should be using fewer, less expensive, or public attorneys for this versus having that come out of this fund. There were comments that we shouldn't get involved in what constitutes construction and design for them. As a construction and design lawyer, I know that you need to have lawyers to negotiate those contracts, or you're probably going to be spending more money than you ought to. So I was the one who made that recommendation that we stay out of that. And in the end, then the advisory council decided to make a motion in sort of two parts, to amend the funding recommended by the NRDP allocated to project one, the Durant Canyon Miles Crossing to German Gulch portion of the trail, to require no matching funds for that. And the rationale behind that was that project one was going to happen first. Would they have time to get matching funds? I will note we had been suggesting and requesting that they do that, but would they have time to do that? And there was suggestion that perhaps some of that money that didn't go to Rock Creek and Flint Creek could be used in order to relieve that funding pressure for project one. But to keep the matching fund, the advisory council voted to keep the matching fund requirement for project two, which was Highway 1 to Stewart Street, that portion of the trail. And the advisory council voted that the funding for both projects 1 and 2 both required assurances from the Greenway Service District regarding the operations and maintenance of those trails for future. This advisory council, I believe, has been pretty crystal clear. We don't intend to treat this fund as a maintenance fund. You want a project done, it's got to fit within what the advisory council views the requirements are for funding it. It's not a maintenance fund. And the advisory council voted that the Greenway Service District be given notice that future funding requests for recreation dominant projects will require matching funds. It was a long discussion, and the advisory council put together this set of agreements that we felt like did the best we could to reconcile what everybody needed within the funding that was available.
And I would note, this is Doug speaking, that I've been going to advisory council meetings now for over 20 years, and this was the longest advisory council meeting I've participated in, and would like to congratulate the council members for their diligence and sticking with it and actually coming up with recommendations and motions on all of this. So And now, Chris, we will open it to comments from the council and public.
Yeah, I'm curious whether we should do these in parts or just wide open. Yeah, I think it might be clearer to everyone where we are in the program if we first have questions from the council on the left-hand side, these motions 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, and 12. Does that make sense? Those were discussed sort of as one. Yeah, basically everything 2 through 12 on the left-hand side for those of us here. So
Could I add one more comment? I know I'm sort
Please,
of going on,
please.
just but with respect to the Greenway Services District, I think it's important here to note that the NRDP had an updated recommendation that with respect to seeking, and I don't know that I mentioned during my comments during the advisory council meeting, the Greenway Services District's attorney actually requested the seek, and that's why we had half seek, half require.
well, I think we can talk about any suggested alternatives for motions and changes to any changes from what the advisory council recommended as we're working on each group, if that makes sense. I had a question for Bill. When we talk about, so looking at advisory council's number 5 recommendation regarding Milltown Dam, is there a response from FWP on whether the advisory council not funding Milltown Dam would, change things for that part?
Madam Chair, certainly it's going to be, require us to look for some other funding sources, and in particular, the capital component of that had to do with the failing. It's actually a geologic issue at the overlook that is apparently some shifting of ground there and potential failing of that and of the collapse of the tunnel underneath the railroad tunnel. We'll have to look for some other funding for that. And the idea there was to move the kiosk, the informational area back, and fencing to make it safe. But we'll simply have to look for other sources for that. As far as the maintenance funding goes, that was also part of the original proposal. There is still NRD money and balance that we'll continue to use for the park. And then at some point, we're simply going to have to seek a spending authority from the legislature on that. So we're comfortable with it as is.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I do, Madam Chair, well, first a comment just on the water flow suggestions, site-specific plans. I think that's a really great idea. I think that makes a lot of sense. I have a handful of questions on the monitoring. Is the $1 million recommended, is that to augment what is already spent for monitoring? So it'd be an additional $1 million?
Director Dorrington, yes, that would be so there are Fish, Wildlife and Parks has funding both from its own department and as well as some funding from NRDP to assess the fishery or look at the fishery associated with the projects that we are submitting. So yes, this would be in addition to that, looking at what is going on with the fishery and trying to determine, where we need to go, as well as, potential restoration actions if there are actions that could be taken to help decrease that impact of whatever's going on.
Okay, so then follow up. I'm critical of this one. I'm just gonna be honest. I think, are there practical solutions that are already known since there's low flow or high temps or activity, including remedy and restoration projects that would affect the fishery? My hesitation for this specific item is that you take $1 million out of what you could do to improve to monitor. And I'm not saying monitoring's bad, right? But if FWP is already monitoring and practical solutions are already available, does that $1 million get you more commensurate with what restoration might get you for an improved fishery?
Director Dorrington, at this point in time, we don't know where to direct those funds. So Fish, Wildlife and Parks has assessed some of the issues. They continue to look at the population itself. Nathan Cook with the program works very closely with Fish, Wildlife and Parks on that. I know this past summer he finished what they call the odorless study, and I think he presented that to the council last year. That's where they look at the inner ear of the fish to try to figure out where they're coming from. They did a little different take on that this year, and they found out that basically the 1-year fish that are in the Clark Fork aren't surviving, and we don't know why they are not surviving. They survived in the past. If you look at the history of the Clark Fork River, the river in the past ran red, and there were very large fish kills, and those fish came back. We had historic numbers, very high numbers, around 2015, 2016. And since then, we have seen a steady decline down to historic lows. And we have had the correct conditions. High flows are very good for fish populations. They do very well at spawning, and typically when Fish, Wildlife and Parks samples, they sample the 3-year-old fish or older. So 3 years after a high flow, you typically see an increase in the fish population. We have had several high flows since that time, and those fish have not come back. And the fact that we have lost those year 1 fish that they noted this year in that odorless study leads us to think that it is something other than what, we don't know where to spend the restoration dollars. So I guess that's what I'm getting at. There's some evaluation that needs to be done so that we know where to spend those restoration dollars or how to spend those restoration dollars to try to restore that fishery.
Thanks for the input. So priority would be a product prioritization of where the money would go is a product of the monitoring.
That is correct. That is our goal. That there would be a recommendation to, how should we be spending our money?
Madam Chair, if I might, Christy Beal. I have a comment in regard to the monitoring, and what I believe is an important component of monitoring is to make sure that the various data sets are being coordinated or correlated, overlaying them in some manner that suggests where you might need to, where you're best spending your money, you're getting the biggest bang for your buck, is something that I have advocated as I've been on this advisory council. I'm a big proponent of monitoring, but then we need to use that monitoring well. And I'd like to see that done a little better so that there is better correlation. And so it's not, there's data over here and there's data over here and there's data over here and there's data over here. Correlate that. Maybe there's one piece we're missing. Maybe we already have the data. We're just not looking at it in the manner in which it needs to be viewed in order to get to that point of how are we best spending our money? What really is working?
Thank you, Christy. Follow up to both of those a little bit. How long does it take to direct? I mean, I think that's one question is, are we monitoring for years on end without taking action? I think that's the concern that I'm hearing. So it would be useful to hear this, how that research and then input cycle, how that feedback cycle, how it works a little bit better, Doug.
So I will say we've started some planning of how to do this. Nathan has worked with Fish, Wildlife and Parks. He's also worked with DEQ staff and folks from the USGS and some other agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, on how to develop a plan to use this funding to most effectively determine what is going on with the fishery. So the first step would be to develop that plan. They have gone through several steps of evaluating, for instance, looking at water quality with the USGS and DEQ. They've also done some steps at looking at the fishery itself and the population. But they do know that they do need to develop a plan so that we can actually get a product out of that and figure out what we need to do. As far as a time frame, I'm sorry, I'm taking a very long time to get to your question. Some solutions might come out in a year. We might come up with some information that says, there are some water quality issues, there's some groundwater issues or something out there that we could potentially do some pilot studies on and direct some funds to. Long term, I would have to, look at Nathan and ask Nathan if he had an idea of how long it might take to get. I haven't worked on a biological study in quite a while. So, you want me to ask Nathan or?
Yeah, that would be helpful to have a little more input on that. And while we're another area that Nathan might be able to address is falling fish populations are not restricted to the Clark Fork. They're in other areas as well, as we all know. So what assurance do we have that research is not, that will end up in action and is being headed with the same vision that restoring populations and, lessons in the Big Hole, for example, or lessons in others are also being used. And I think this is a different way of saying one of Christie's comments from earlier. So that's a little bit I'd like to address.
I think Nathan's the one to answer that.
Perfect. Thank you. Nathan?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to chime in. Okay. In terms of the time frame, my thought is, rather committing and saying we are going to know all the answers in 2 years or 4 years or whatever it is. I would just like to reiterate that our approach has always been an adaptive management approach. So FWP has been doing monitoring the Clark Fork River, for over a decade now, and we've seen this trend developing. It's sort of reached a head in 2023, but we've seen that population going down, and we have. I would argue that we've already taken action. We've taken some steps that we think are appropriate, including focusing more on habitat and integrated along with the remediation in the Clark Fork River. So that's one example where we're trying to use these monitoring data as they're collected and take steps right away. So I think that's an approach we're going to continue to take. And of course, with $1 million, that sounds like a lot of money. It's that's not going to get us 10 years worth of monitoring. So I would think we'd have to have an answer. We'd have those funds spent out in 4 years. So the other part in terms of working and coordinating with the folks in Region 3 and what's going on in the Big Hole, that's a really good point, because a lot of the trends that we're seeing with brown trout appear to be regional. Brown trout appear to be struggling in certain larger rivers that tend to be a little bit warmer. So I think there's a lot of knowledge to be shared there, and we are cross-pollinating there. We're meeting with folks here in a few weeks to talk about that stuff.
Thank you. Other questions?
I do have one, if Nathan's willing to stay up. This is Christy Beal. Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know if I'm getting the cart before the horse because the funding hasn't been there yet, but in considering this, has there been, in considering this additional monitoring correlation, is there any consideration to correlating information and data that's already there. And I don't mean just in the Clark Fork. There could be a macroinvertebrate study in the Big Hole that tells us a lot about what we need to be doing with respect to soils, or, there's a lot of data out there. There are multiple universities in this state. Is there any consideration to correlating data that is already in existence versus paying for reinventing some of those wheels?
Yes, that, when we're looking at all the things on the Clark Fork River that we could possibly look at, all the different chemicals and metals and water temperature, it's a little bit overwhelming. So my thought, and the thought of folks I'm collaborating with, let's look at the data sets we have. Let's go through the USGS data sets. Let's go through DEQs, integrate it with FWPs, and boil that all down to what has changed. What has changed over this time period that seems to be critical since 2015, since this population with fish populations has declined. So to me, that's the bare minimum. That's the first step. That's the thing we need to do. And there's support with our partner agencies to do that. I think we'll have to, we may need to find someone and pay potentially someone to, to integrate all that data. But that's the first step in terms of looking at water quality and all the data that are out there.
Other questions or comments among the council for these select set of motions?
Question.
Yes, Valerie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For Doug, the original NRDP allocations were based on available projects. Are there additional projects in Warm Springs Creek for that additional $225,000?
So to answer your question, yes, there are projects on Warm Springs Creek for that additional funding. The first thing that we do need to do that is outlined in the plan is to do the assessment of Warm Springs Creek to identify the highest priority projects that are remaining and work on those, similar to what we have in other watersheds, from the highest priority to the lowest priority. But yes, there are projects there.
Thank you. Chris?
Madam Chair, just one more question. Doug, on section 5, you talked about for the Greenway project, you talked for a minute about other funds that could be used. And I think it was kind of in backfill if the funds aren't available but still needed. Could you run through that one more time? And then part B is, could you verify that we're not voting on anything that those funds, whether or not they would be available and then spent, that would be a separate decision? Is that correct? So first, is that what you meant? And can you run through that one more time on other funds? And then 2, we're not voting on those other funds. Is that correct?
That is correct. You wouldn't be voting on the other funds. What we would do is we would look at if the parent funding was not sufficient, we would look at other funds within the Upper Clark Fork River Basin Restoration Fund that are not going to be used within the next 4 years that we could use to backfill the Greenway allocation. And then the way that we have written this proposal in the plan is that then those areas where we did take that funding from would be the first priority for reimbursement during the next revision. So for instance, but one of the places where we wouldn't have to do that would be, so we drew the line at how much interest was available back in March, because we had to start somewhere. We had to put the stop somewhere. So we did it in March. Between March and now, we have accrued interest in that aquatics fund, or in the Upper Clark Fork River Basin Restoration Fund. So that interest it hasn't been allocated to projects, and that would be potentially available to help backfill any deficit that the parent would not provide to the Greenway. So that would be the first place I would look, for instance, because those funds aren't allocated at this point.
Okay, Madam Chair, I just wanted, my comment would be, I want to ensure that the motion that we have before us limits our scope to not commit something that we don't know would be available. So yes, in concept, good idea, but I don't want to create a vote that says, here's your backfill, and we don't really know fully whether those funds are available. That's my question, or that's my comment, and I think Doug satisfied the question. Christie, I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Christy Beal, you were reading my mind. My question would be this. Is it anticipated that the money coming back from the Parrot Tailings project plus the interest since March is going to cover the backfill to the Greenway Services District? Or are we still potentially looking at having to take money from somewhere else that we've just talked about today?
So Madam Chair, members of council, it is anticipated that that interest would be available. So for instance, the first project would go in 2024 potentially. And we should have the funding to cover that. The next project would not go for a couple of years. So we would have 2 more years of for interest to accrue in the restoration fund. And that is our thought of where that funding, if it's needed, for instance, that second reach, that second project, where that funding could come from. So it would not come from it would not come from one of the allocations you're voting on today, or potentially it wouldn't come from an allocation that's already been made.
Doug, I have a process question. If, help me understand at what point this council might take additional action
Yes.
if those funds were to, appear, and would we have an additional decision point then to say, yes, please use those dollars for these purposes?
Madam Chair, so I would say the way what we have proposed today in the revision, there wouldn't be, but we could add a provision that any additional funding or if we were to take funds from somewhere else, that would need advisory council, trustee council, and trustee approval. We could add that to that provision.
Madam Chair, may I comment further, just
Yes,
briefly?
please.
So here's my experience, is that you have a project and a scope, and then you advance that into your crystal ball, and oftentimes either scope changes a little bit, or like in the case of the last year, you have record inflation. So your usability of those funds doesn't go as far. I would recommend that there'd be a future decision point for use of the interest funds, not just to limit what is possible, but to be practical, to say at the time of the decision, you have funds available.
Thank you. Mr. Harris.
Madam Chair, I'm going to bring us up to a little bit higher elevation and try and walk back into this a little bit. These funds have a specific criteria they need to meet. Would that be correct? Okay. And as projects get submitted for funding, what kind of scoring system do they utilize to rank those projects as they come in?
Madam Chair and Mr. Harris, so the criteria that Brian put up for the Broken Circle Ranch, so is technical criteria, cost benefit, cost effectiveness, public comment, technical feasibility. There are numerous natural resource damage criteria that are laid out in the Department of Interior's natural resource damage regulations that we follow. So all of the projects that came in had to meet those criteria. We also have some specific state policy criteria that they have to meet, as well as criteria within the restoration plan. So all of the projects that were submitted back in February had to meet those criteria, or we ranked all those projects using those criteria, or evaluated those projects, excuse me, using that criteria. In the restoration plan, it does stipulate that we are to implement these projects based on priority projects, and using our partners at Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the resource managers, as well as our partners in the private sector who actually know a lot of these watersheds and the resource areas that we work in. We have prioritized many of the watersheds and identified the limiting factors in these. And I'm speaking watersheds, I'm speaking in aquatics because that's mostly where we're allocating funding. And so, yes, we do have a process of which we do to rank each of these projects and evaluate the costs that we should allocate to each of the watersheds based on that, on the ranking and the available projects.
Okay. And so based on, on those criteria, as we go through the list of 2 through 12, that's kind of what I was wanting to understand a little bit more is, number 2, whether we were to approve, those particular, I'm sorry, number 3 would be for the aquatic monitoring. Where did that rank overall with the submissions for proposals?
Well, that, I guess that's subjective. You're asking me. And Chris knows the Clark Fork River is near and dear to my heart. You know, one of the main goals of the restoration plan is to restore the main stem fisheries of the Clark Fork, of Silverbow Creek and the Clark Fork. So trying to figure out what the problem is with the fishery is a main question that we have to answer in order for us to restore that fishery. So I would say that would rank very high.
And then when projects are completed, or have been projects that have been ongoing, what is required to measure their success for, you know, for instance, the watershed, excuse me, the watershed education project? What sideboards are we putting in there as far as what we expect to see use that money to be used for and results from it?
So I think I understand your question, Mike. So all of the projects that we implement, we're required to monitor. And we do project, and we're not going to get to it today. It's in our project update, where we do project monitoring, watershed monitoring, and then basin monitoring for both terrestrial and aquatic projects. Actually, all the projects, and also the ones in Section 5, the recreation projects. So we do monitor all of those to make sure that they're functioning correctly, that they're being maintained, and that we are seeing the outcomes that we want from those. So for instance, on the fish screens, we work a lot with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to ensure that putting in a fish screen is actually successful at keeping fish out of the stream and getting more fish to the main stem. And Nathan presented information last year associated with the large screen that we did at Allendale and also on screens on Cottonwood Creek that shows that we are being successful. Those screens are successful of keeping fish in stream and moving them to the main stem. So those are projects that we monitor to show that we are trying to meet those goals. And if we weren't, then we would be adaptive management of, you know, doing something different.
Madam Chair, one more follow-up. I guess what I'm trying to make sure I understand, and I'm not picking on or saying that we shouldn't fund the watershed education program, but as a person who went to the watershed education website and looked at it, the STEM research and education components seem to be very highly progressive and positive. But is the artwork program really necessary? And I don't want to lose funding for a fish screener restoration project because it was used on something that wasn't necessarily scientific or could be tied back to mitigation, which is where the money came from.
So every 2 years when the Clark Fork Education Program comes forward with their budget, they do present information about what they have achieved this year, their goals and that type of thing. And Ray Lynn is here today if you want to hear from her on that. But I would say that they do a very good job of meeting the goals that they set out, reaching a large number of folks, and they're the presentation they presented, and again, Christie may be able to address some of this too. The presentation at the advisory council meeting in July pointed to a lot of, or excuse me, I forget, maybe it was May, pointed to a lot of very high success rate of that watershed education program.
Madam Chair, if I might.
Yes.
Mr. AG, I was one of those, I was right where you are. I had a lot of concerns about it. I didn't see the science behind it. And I've since come to realize that there are sometimes less tangible benefits to the resource than a scientific study might be able to show us. And I can tell you that the CFWEP's presentation and conversations that I've had with Raylan, learning about the number of small children's minds that are impacted, the conversations they have with their siblings and their parents and their grandparents, and a knowledge base that they wouldn't otherwise have. So for me, that's what turned me around, is realizing if people don't know there's a problem, I mean, people are already forgetting about 9/11. And most people just drive by that pit. They don't even know what it is. And so educating them to understand the impact of all of that that happened is something that we can't just leave it up to chance that the next generation is going to understand it, because my guess is chance isn't going to make that happen. And then we do all of this, and in 10, 15 years, nobody's doing anything. So that's what got me. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Additional questions from the council? Mr. Harris?
One more quick one, Madam Chair. As we look at the proposals and we're talking about setting the matching funds requirements, I'm not familiar. Typically, the program, you have requirements that are set and everybody has to meet those requirements. I haven't been familiar with a program where one proposal would have matching funds requirements, but other may not. And I'd like some clarification on that, because to me, when you start treating different projects by a different set of rules, it becomes dangerous. And so I just wanted to understand, the standardizations, being this is federal mitigation money and state mitigation money and public money, that we're following things in a way that's defensible as far as the criteria we use and what we hold people to.
So is your question whether there is a single or statutory based matching component for this entire plan?
Yes, Madam Chair, that's would be that is there across the board?
Doug, could you address that, please?
Yes, I can, Madam Chair and Mike. So we did propose consistent requirements that all priority aquatic and terrestrial projects seek match. Those are projects, for instance, working on priority aquatics, like putting in a fish screen, or a priority terrestrial project of improving habitat somewhere. The recreation-based projects, we had a revision. Those were the revisions that were proposed for Section 6, and that they require a 25% match. So that's what the program did require. It was the advisory council's discussion and ultimately their motion, where they proposed that the project 1 for the Greenway Service District not have matching funds, but project 2 have matching funds. So I don't mean to pass the buck to you, Christie, but that was, so there was in the plan, there is consistency there.
I have one additional question. It's when we talk about Section 1 and Section 2, that's new to me. And is it 2.5 million would only cover Section 1, or would that be spread between 2 parts? I think that might help us. We all have that same understanding as we go in.
Madam Chair, the 2.5 million is for the design and construction for both both trail sections, project 1 and project 2.
Thank you. Uh,
I was just reflecting back to one of Doug's slides where he had the matching funds set out there. That might be helpful to flash back to that slide. It's, I don't know, I guess it's about your 10th slide. There you go.
And yes, I meant, and that was why I was unclear, because it seemed like the recommendations were that we were going to require match across the board.
My understanding was, so that was NRD's in recommendation in the original plan. The advisory council amended that with the case of the Greenway Service District, section 1, if I understand that correctly.
Well, the recommendation for amending section 6 of the plan is here, but that amendment hasn't happened yet. So during the advisory council's meeting, there was a lot of discussion as to whether or not it was fair to require that matching now of Greenway Service District. And so we reconciled that by saying, all right, for the first part of the project, you got to seek it and you got to show us you sought it. Second part, we're going to require it because there's time.
And as a follow-up, this brings up a conversation that we had earlier, that this is not the first money that Greenway Service District has received. And previously there was not a match required in previous versions of this plan.
Christy Beal, that is correct.
Additional questions or comments from the council? And we've kind of spread out amongst them, but it's kind of free for all right now. But do we have public comment? Right, or questions? What do I go to next? Or do we
Madam
make
Chair,
the-
Madam Chair, I would recommend that we go to, if there are any questions from the public. I think we're going to get comments from the public when we get to the motions. So maybe that
Perfect.
would be.
If there are questions from the public, this would be the time when all the smart people can provide guidance. I'm getting a head shake from the back from Brian showing down online. Great, thank you.
So Madam Chair, would you like me to move to the motion slides that we have?
That would be
prepared?
great. Thank you.
Okay. So the natural resource damage program, and this is going to hopefully help with motions. The natural resource damage program has, on this table, you see what our proposed allocations were for watersheds, the advisory council's proposal, and what we would propose to the trustee council as a proposed recommendation. So the recommendation for all this, the ones in white would be the same as the advisory council had recommended. The two Flint Creek and Rock Creek, what we would propose there, and we have language in a coming slide, is that the TRC consider the advisory council's recommendation, but the Trout Unlimited has come forward in working with Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and it indicated they can get additional match for these watersheds. And our proposal would be is if they could get additional match, then additional dollars be added to those watersheds to complete additional projects. And that motion is in number 3 in your slide, but I'll put it up on the slide here in a minute. As far as the allocations to section 5 with the recreation and the CWIP program, these allocations that we had proposed and the advisory council had proposed would be the same dollar amount. We would propose something slightly different for the Greenway Service District as a motion. So what we did as a proposed motion for the advisory council is lumped motions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, and 12. These are ones that the advisory council accepted the NRD's recommendation, except for the Milltown one. But we would propose to move forward with that, these could be lumped together as one motion for the advisory council, or excuse me, the trustee restoration council.
Quick point of process, Madam Chair. Doug, you referenced motion number 1. I think you meant to eliminate that because that's already been voted upon.
I did, I'm sorry.
Motion number 2. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I have a question then.
Yes.
Can you go back, Doug? I just want to make sure I understand one more, to the match question. So does TU have a max contribution or a percentage? So there's a multiplier and raising, from the AC recommendation, you're raising it. Is it because they can provide more money to match more what NRD is proposing as an allocation? Does this make sense? If you do a percentage and you raise one and you get a little bit more and it gets you more, or do they have a max amount they're committing and you just want to put more money in the streams? And I'm agnostic on the answer. I just want to know what it is. One's a multiplier and one's just a set plus amount. What is TU committing?
So, Madam Chair and Chris, what TU is committed to is providing a 50% match on the projects in these streams. And looking at the priority projects with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks that are obtainable in the next 4 years, what we were looking at is trying to have approximately $750,000 for those projects in each of these allocations. TU has committed to trying to bring $750,000 to each of these watersheds so that we could complete those projects for 1.5. It's approximately $1.5 million in each watershed.
Follow up, Madam Chair. So more money we will allocate at the 50% rate more to the stream.
That is correct.
I'm good, thanks.
Madam Chair, if I might.
Yes.
As I'm understanding this, is the increase from the AC proposal to the TRC proposal, does it directly correlate to additional funds that TU can bring? Like, is each dollar above 250,000 on the One Creek, raising that to 400,000, is that because there is an additional $150,000 available in match if that's increased? Is it a direct correlation?
I believe so, but I would leave that to Casey Hackathorn with Trout Unlimited. But I do believe that is the case. They are committing to a 50% match. And if we could, if Casey can answer that question, it would be helpful.
Sure, Casey Hackathorn, Trout Unlimited. So the situation is there's $1.5 million in each of those watersheds in priority projects, NRD priorities, with willing partners, and we've identified potential federal funders that essentially, if that money's on the table, we think we can go out and match it at least 50%, at least 1-to-1, potentially more than that. Some of the federal programs right now, because of the wave of money through bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act funding, it's a ripe environment right now to leverage NRD dollars to bring in those federal funds. So we'll commit to going to seek those. We don't have it on the table right now, but because of the time period, we're hopeful that dedicating those dollars for those watersheds would allow us to leverage the outside funding to complete them.
Thank you for that clarification.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I have to make sure, this is Christy Beal, the advisory council members, since this has come up, we haven't had a meeting since then, but advisory council members have asked that I be clear in that the advisory council wasn't provided that information. And there are several council members who would prefer, if there's extra funding that can be allocated, that it be allocated to the priority one streams.
Thank you for providing that feedback from the advisory council. Any additional questions? I think that's where, or we're going through the motions. Okay. If you could continue.
This would be a proposed motion for the Flint Creek and Rock Creek drainages, that we would, the program would recommend or proposes a draft recommendation to the Trustee Restoration Council that you accept the advisory council's recommendation of the allocation of $300,000 to Rock Creek and $250,000 to Flint Creek from the Restoration Fund, with an amendment that if matching funds of 50% or greater are obtained for priority projects as approved by FWP and NRDP, then an additional $200,000 be added to Rock Creek and an additional $150,000 be added to the Flint Creek watershed. And I would add a note that the dollar values are a little different there based on the current allocation of funds to those watersheds to meet the dollar value that Casey talked about there, that there's $1.5 million worth of projects, and if they got 50% match, so we were trying to get that funding to $750,000.
I have a point of clarification. Matching funds of 50% indicates in this context 50% of the total. Because it almost sounds to me like the matching is 100%, because for every dollar that is put up, there's another dollar that comes from an outside. Is that, if this is the common, if you've been doing this a long time, if this is the way that it is commonly referred to, I am fine keeping it as is the standard, but I just am hoping to get straight in my mind if we are talking about one-to-one match is the same as a 50% match.
Madam Chair, I have no problem changing this. If it's clear to you guys that it should be 100%, we could put 100% there, but it is a one-to-one match. That's what they are proposing, at least a one-to-one match. For every NRD dollar, there would be a matching dollar.
If there's other comment from that.
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I may. I mean, I've seen a lot of projects funded in this manner and with matching requirements. And typically, I think you take the entire project cost, say it's $1 million project, and you put in a grant and they require a 50% match. Well, then what you're really asking for is $500,000. So typically, I think that's referred to as a 50% match.
Typically, that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification. You see a lot more of these than I do. So I'm comfortable with that if it is the common way to discuss it. Mr. Harrison.
Madam Chair, technical question. As these funds were born out of federal law and where potential funding mechanisms that would be coming in are also coming out of federal funding, do we have legal opinions from EPA, Interior, or internally as to whether or not matching funds, these would be prohibited from being used as matching funds from other conservation federal funds?
I'd be happy to refer that to Doug.
Yes, Madam Chair and Mike, these are state funds that has been established. And we have used these very successfully to leverage other federal funds for other projects. But these are state funds administered by the trustee.
Additional questions about the motion? The formulation of the motion, I guess, as I should say. Because we will still have additional time for comment and discussion of the content of the motions. We're, I think, trying to figure out what they all say at this point.
Madam Chair, do you want to go through these individually, or do we want to go through all three of them and
and come back.
and come back.
I would kind of prefer to go through them one or, some of these questions have been overarching, but we're getting it narrowed down to the point where I think we can start taking some action and getting the earlier ones off the table, if that's agreeable. So, yeah, so if there are other general questions, I think this is appropriate.
Okay, I think this question fits in here with regard to the match requirement for Flint Creek and Rock Creek. It seems like it would go outside of what is now being required under the revised plan, where these types of projects would have to seek match, but there wasn't a percentage. Is that right? And
Can we look at that motion again? The second motion. I think, let me just say the way I read it, is that if those are available at that higher level, they would be prioritized, and then the money would be funneled that direction. If, Doug, if you want to describe your understanding.
Yes, as far as the Flint Creek and Rock Creek, I do think, Valerie, and correct me if I'm wrong, were you asking that for aquatic and terrestrial priority projects, they are only required to seek matching funds. They are not required to get matching funds. Is that what you were getting at?
that's what I'm asking. And so are the Flint Creek and Rock Creek, those are priority projects, right? Or not?
That is correct. They are priority projects.
Okay. So I guess I just want to point out that I feel like this match requirement for Flint Creek and Rock Creek kind of asks, it goes above and beyond what's being recommended in the revised plan.
I think it unquestionably goes above and beyond what is in the, and I think my reasoning for why it does that is because it goes against the recommendation of the advisory council. Would that, that's a judgment call on my part, but it seems to me that in order to show that this council understands that it is going against the recommendation of the advisory council, we are asking for a higher bar to be met.
So Madam Chair, I would, these first list of motions are motions, for instance, the number 2 is just the administrative updates to the plan. Number 3 is the aquatic monitoring. Number 4 is the watershed education program. Milltown. These are all of the motions that the advisory council accepted the natural resource damage programs revisions to, and the funding allocation. And that's where we had proposed the motion to you, but if you guys would like to modify that, you can, but the proposed motion is for you to accept their motion, accepting our motion.
Correct. If I might suggest before we launch into what could be a lengthy conversation, let's maybe recess for a brief 5-minute recess. People get a drink and return, and we will reconvene at 3:15. Okay, I think we're back in action. Reconvening. I need a gavel. We are to the point of the program, the TRC motion. If it's acceptable to the council, I will ask Christy Bale to state the motion number 2. And then after that, we will have public comment and discussion from ours. Then we will do 2, and we'll move it to the next one. Then we will do each of these individually.
Okay. The TRC proposed motion is the UCFRB TRC recommends accepting the NRDP and UCFRB Advisory Council's recommendations as they pertain to the UCFRB Advisory Council's motions 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, and 12.
Second. Is there a second? Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know if I am supposed to second, but
Second.
oh, thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. Do we have public comment on that motion, which includes all of the motions that NRDP had originally proposed and the advisory council accepted?
Madam Chair, do we have council comment first, then public comment? I thought that's why we did the first motion. I'm sorry if that's not correct.
I don't have where the council. I don't have that on my agenda. Do you have an opinion, Doug?
Madam Chair, this is Doug. The way the agenda is written and which we have used in the past, it went public comment on the motion and then trustee council discussion of that
Great, thanks.
after the motion.
Appreciate the clarification.
Thank you. Is there public comment on the motion? Recognizing, I don't know who this person is, but please introduce yourself for the record. if you
Madam
would.
Chair, esteemed members of the council, I'm Raylyn Brandel with the Clark Fork Watershed Education Program. I just wanted to make a comment about why education is included in the restoration plan. It was part of the initial process plan and long range guidance plan set forth by the councils that were originally established when the natural resource damage program was established. And so as part of that process plan and long range guidance plan, those councils recognize the need for continuing education about the issues related to Superfund and related to the cleanup for the long-term future. And as Ms. Beal so eloquently put, talking about the stewardship of the resource and maintaining the resource long past our lives and long past us. So that's been our call to action, is to raise the next generation of stewards for this environment and for the Clark Fork in particular. And to particularly put the punctuation on why art is important is because it's often a way that those students that don't think of themselves as scientists can start to engage in understanding about this resource. And we also provide 50% match to our program. And so that match, those match dollars are often coming from people that are outside of the STEM sort of realm, and particularly that program, our friends at WET, I'm pointing to Elizabeth, and our friends at the Butte Silver Bow Council of Commissioners gave us a grant contract to do stormwater education and stormwater art related to working on their MS4 project. So that was a match to the NRD. The NRD dollars are spent directly on students in the Clark Fork Basin doing the watershed science programming. And so we serve right around 3,000 students per year with that. We're cresting into 80,000 students we've served over the course of our lifetime as a program. So had a long reach. A lot of students have been served. Some of them, I actually just walked by one of our students, Bailey, was in the hallway when I was on my way up here, and we got a high five. So that made me super happy. She was one of our 7th graders who turned into one of our graduate students that worked on projects with us for a long time. So we are filling that STEM pipeline and helping this cause for the greater good into the long term. And we will be back in June, so I'll be sure to highlight all the things that we've done and perhaps bring this council up to speed as well in terms of that 15 years of service.
Thank you. Since the day is getting short, I am going to ask commenters to keep their comments to 2 minutes, if that is agreeable to the council. Thank you. Any other additional public comment on motion number 2? Seeing no additional, oh, is there online comment? Ryan, okay. No, no virtual commenters noted at this time for the motion. With that, let's proceed to discussion on the motion amongst the council. Chris.
Madam Chair, just reflective of our conversation regarding monitoring and Christie's, I think, appropriate direction of coordination of the data. I just wanted to be that on the record saying I do think monitoring is a good thing. I do think that as it directs prioritization and as the data is coordinated, I think better outcomes can be had through projects. My only hesitation, and I'm not a vote no, but my hesitation is just that $1 million in monitoring is $1 million out of a project. And so I really do respect the advisory council's hard work on data coordination. I appreciate that.
Thank you. I wanted to note as well that because of this conversation, we will be asking additional questions on a fairly regular basis about the progress and where they are. This council doesn't meet as often as I see these folks, so I appreciate the focus. Additional comments on or discussion on the motion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to a vote. All those in favor of motion number 2, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries. The next motion is number 3 on our paper. This is the draft that is proposed that we have discussed considers additional funding because we believe that more match is available. And I believe, Bill, I have you lined up for this motion.
And it's a mouthful.
There's a lot of letters in all of these.
Madam Chair, the UCFRB TRC recommends accepting the UCFRB Advisory Council recommendation of funding $300,000 to Rock Creek and $250,000 to Flint Creek from the UCFRB Aquatic and Terrestrial Resources Restoration Fund, with the amendment that if matching funds of 50% or greater are obtained for priority projects approved by FWP and NRDP, an additional $200,000 will be allocated to the Rock Creek watershed and $150,000 will be allocated to the Flint Creek watershed. So moved.
Second.
Chris Dorrington.
I guess that's a question mark. I should say, is there a second?
Hey, you're good.
Question mark. Thank you,
Mhm.
Director Dorrington. Do we have public comment on the motion? in the room? In cyberspace? And do we have any, seeing none, we'll proceed to discussion of the motion amongst the council. Do we have additional questions or conversation? Seeing none?
Madam Chair,
Oh, yes,
if I may,
yes, please.
I just want to make
Okay.
sure again with Doug, perhaps that my interpretation here is correct. That the council voted 300,000 for Rock Creek, 250,000 for Flint Creek, for a total of $550,000. The motion on the table would add $350,000 if matching funds to the extent of 50% can be obtained or found. So 550 plus 350, $900,000. What this means in the end is if an additional $900,000 can be found in terms of matching fund, we've got a project balance or project potential availability of funding for $1.8 million, including the match. Is that accurate?
Madam Chair, Bill, that is not correct. So
That is not correct.
what we are looking at is the Trout Unlimited is proposed to bringing, there is approximately $1.5 million of projects in Flint Creek and $1.5 million of projects in Rock Creek that are priority projects. What we looked at is the existing allocation of funding to those watersheds and providing the funding to get so those watersheds had a minimum of $750,000. The allocations that we're proposing here, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at existing available funds that's already allocated to those watersheds. That's why they're different amounts. Rock Creek has a smaller allocation at this time than Flint Creek does. So what we are looking at is trying to get $750,000 in each of those watersheds if, to meet the match requirements that TU says they could get. If we stick with the advisory council's recommendation, we can still do projects. There's money in those allocated to those. There's not enough, this money would get us to that $750,000 benchmark that would help us reach the total that's needed for those projects. I'm.
Okay, thank you, Doug.
Madam Chair, Mr. Martin, one follow-up there. And this motion would be, what we're doing is we're putting that $750,000 in funds available for projects going towards the Rock Creek but it's because we mentioned the Trout Unlimited is potentially bringing projects, but can be different than they've already applied for specific projects. There's money available that TU or some group would be applying for.
Madam Chair, Mike, yes, that is correct. So this money would be available if TU gets that money, then we would propose, if this motion is passed, then that money would be available for those projects. So yes, TU would be leveraging this money for their matching funds.
Madam Chair, follow-up, but would only TU be able to apply for this money?
No, it would be the way this is written. If those additional fundings is matched, if it came from somebody else for this, if TU stepped out of the room, yes, this funding would still be available.
It's my understanding that TU to this point is a known partner, but this is not restrictive to any one grant partner. Any additional discussion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to a vote. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay.
Nay.
No question. Is Attorney General's office a voting member?
Madam Chair, you're correct. Sorry, Mike, your Attorney General does not have a vote.
We probably could have figured that earlier, but I appreciate your questions. Um, Motion carries. And moving on to the third, sorry, motion number 4. Do you just want to, we didn't discuss this, we discussed it some in the larger context, but maybe you could read through and then we can go to public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what the Natural Resource Damage Program has proposed for the Greenway Service District motion, as we had discussed, there's a lot of conversation at the advisory council meeting. What we would propose is that the Trustee Restoration Council recommend the advisory council's recommendation, motion 11A, with the requirement, and this would change their 11A, with the requirement that the Greenway Service District seek matching funds of at least 25% for project 1 and provide documentation of all the applications and responses of that seeking to the Natural Resource Damage Program and the Upper Clark Fork River Basin Advisory Council. If I can, Madam Chair, the reason that we would ask this seek is that it is something that was discussed at the Advisory Council, and it also is consistent with the recommendation of this council to require that all projects seek matching funds. And, you know, it's not a requirement that they get it, but at least that they seek it, because we all know that these funds are limited, and the more we can bring in from outside sources, the further all these funds can go.
I have one question that I'm not sure we discussed before. What is the split, the cost split between project 1 and project 2?
Madam Chair, project 1 is approximately $1.5 million and project 2 is approximately $1 million.
Thank you. I think we should make the motion. We need a motion first and then we can do questions, but I have might be a parliamentary question. I would suggest a different, we have a draft TRC motion, but I would like to make a slight addition. I think it's, no, I think it's everything. Do you want to keep it B? It's everything. That's a good question. Based on the conversation earlier, how here's my proposal. The source of the 2.5 million is would either be refunds from or returns from the Parrot Tailings projects which have not been used, and then secondly, and I mean you had to go somewhere, but in Part A, 11AA says.
So are we back in Arizona right now? Utah. We're in Utah?
For someone online, you should mute your mic if you would, please.
Thank you. If the funds are not available from the Parrot Tailings project, the state's revised proposal is to use funds allocated from the aquatic and terrestrial resources. In order not to put NRD in a position of picking and choosing which those projects are, I would propose that we add as approved by the trustee to that, to ensure that if the Parrot dollars are not available, that this council, that the advisory council, this council, and the trustee, the governor, would have an opportunity to approve the alternative source of funds. If that's agreeable to this group, I would propose that. This amendment, which includes everything that the advisory council, adding the 25%, seek for the 1.5 million or part section A, and then an additional requirement that we approve a change if it is not available through the parent tailings that are available.
Madam Chair, I think that's a good addition. Thank you.
And I could type that, or you could type that. I have it drafted here. I would just say, my amendment would be after, in number 4, the trustee restoration council recommends the UCFRB advisory council's motion 11A, comma, as approved, adding as approved by the trustee restoration council after aquatic and terrestrial resources. You know, we could figure out how to, I don't know if you amend, I don't want to amend what was handed to us from the advisory council, but yeah. Well, we won't have an amendment to an amendment because this is not, the motion hasn't been posed yet. We would, I am proposing that we phrase our motion slightly differently than it is on our sheet of paper that we have.
Madam Chair, Christie Beal, my concern is that the advisory council's proposed motion is couched already in an amendment, our A and B, which I'm not sure is the, so we'd be amending that amendment. It could get confusing. Maybe we take a minute to let her draft it.
Yeah, I want to see it on, I want to see it on the page. Does anybody have a whiteboard? Right there. I think maybe we just start writing. That's not a problem. Tricky. But I want I think this will be fast. We'll be all right. It's locked in under
Actually, where's Brian Barcoya? Brian got to do this typing at the AC.
Notice I'm hiding in the back.
You guys want me to go get Hope?
Yeah.
She's here. The lawyers are probably like, oh, and like, oh, because it's an AK. Yeah, they got it. Right. Got it, got it. They got it. So they- It's frightening. That's what yeah, their recommendations. They'll be done writing that soon. I think we can discuss. Because the only part that we've changed is written down. There is a point of clarification that both Christy and Elizabeth asked. The entire, they asked whether the draft motion includes both part A and B of the advise and C of the advisory council's motion. And the answer is yes, it does, because the entire, if you look to the left here, the entire box point is 11A. So this, yeah, 11A. It's not 11 sub A. Okay. So the motion as it stands, oops, I gave Doug mine, so I might need to read yours. No, it's okay. I'll read. The motion proposed would be that the UCFRB TRC recommends the UCFRB Advisory Council motion 11A, adding as approved by the trustee after resources that's also in 11A, with the requirement that Greenway Service District
seek matching funds of 25% and provide documentation of all applications and responses to the NRDP and UCFRB Advisory Council. Is that understood? All right. With, I think he's good. Do we have a second for that motion?
Second, Chris Dorrington.
Thank you. Do we have public comment on the motion? Thank you. Do we have, seeing no public comment, we will move to discussion of the motion among the council. Christie?
Comment from Christie Beal. Madam Chair, may I go up and take a picture of it so we can find it? Then I'll send it to Doug so we have a way to get it in the record.
Absolutely. Thank you. It will be in the record.
Oh, you're just fine.
Madam Chair, can I make a comment?
Yes, Doug.
So does this go into permanent record? My dad was an 8th grade English teacher, and penmanship was one of his big things that I did not inherit. So I do want to note
We will type it.
that it's not.
It
my
will not
father's.
be, it will not be reflected in your handwriting. And if there are edits that are for clarification purposes that hew to our intent, I'm comfortable with the staff making any changes that would make this legal.
And just from point of clarification, Madam Chair,
Yes.
who besides Doug should I send this picture to?
We can get it.
Okay.
Email, I would say, say email.
I mean, yes, I'll email
Right.
it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Discussion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to a vote. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Longest part was writing it down. Thank you. No, it is confusing when we change things, but I think given the conversation that we had, that was a good addition to make sure that the NRD is not put in a position of picking projects and us being mad at them about it. Okay, next.
Speaking for the advisory council, I appreciate that.
We are now a little over an hour behind schedule. So we look forward to a brief but fascinating financial restoration plan annual update.
Yes, Madam Chair, what we had discussed and what we actually had in our cover letter is we asked the council and the public to review the documents that summarized our annual report, and that if anybody had questions, we would be available to answer any of your questions. If anybody has any questions on those, the financial and the project updates, we'd be happy to address those at this time.
Thank you. From my perspective, Doug and his team do a great job of making themselves available to anybody who might have questions about the plan. So I would say reach out to them if you.
And I would also note that is on there that Christie and Elizabeth can give an update. We did give the update to the Upper Clark Fork River Basin Advisory Council in November, if Christie had any words on that.
I have no further update that what we've just talked about, talked about and voted upon has definitely consumed the advisory council's time.
I'd like to thank Christie and the advisory council for all the work that they put in this to make sure that we were able to start from a product that we knew had been very well vetted by the folks who care a lot about this in the basin. And both Christie and Elizabeth, thank you for your service on those boards. And I know that it's not always easy, and you don't get paid very much money to do it. In fact, you get paid zero money to do it. So thank you for helping make this process possible.
It is my pleasure, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Any closing comments or questions? Oh, one comment, or is there a question? Sure. If we have additional public comment or before the end of the meeting, this would be an appropriate time to. Thank you.
I'm not gonna give. We need you to. Well, I'll go to the. I apologize for missing my particular slot. Thank you, Chair Hagan, members of the Trustee Restoration Council. My name is Dory Scrugert. I work for the City and County of Butte Silver Bow, and I'm the project manager for the Silver Bow Creek Greenway. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. This is the first time since 2012 that a request for grant funds has been made before the trustee. First and foremost, we want to express our appreciation for the support of the Natural Resource Damage Program, TRC, and the trustee who have provided the Greenway Service District in the past for the Silver Bow Creek Greenway, and we are grateful to the recommendation from the NRD staff and advisory council this grant cycle to provide funding to continue our ongoing efforts. We're close to completing restoration work envisioned for Silver Bow Creek, and this funding is critical to see it to its completion. The Greenway project is an ideal example of a restoration project, investing in and protecting aquatic and terrestrial resources and successfully integrating restoration with remedial action directly on the injured resource. It also fulfills the goals of the natural resource damage suit to restore lost recreation opportunities to the citizens of Montana. The Greenway access features were designed to protect the corridor from adverse impacts and have always been a part of the project, which is why it is a special project. Our successful partnerships with the Natural Resource Damage Program and the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, as well as other local and state agencies, have resulted in a national and internationally recognized project. Completion of the project will honor the over $100 million that has been invested in the corridor. We also recognize that there are many worthy restoration projects and limited funds available. To that end, we continue to look for cost savings and seeking additional matching funds beyond what we have done or secured in the past to leverage and extend the funds from the Natural Resource Damage Program to see this project completed for the citizens of Southwest Montana and the state. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional public comment? Is there any online? Okay. All right. None additional online. Thank you, folks, for being here today. With that, today's meeting is closed.